And you have reached the tipping point. Good morning. And today we have a guest, Nadine. Good morning.
Good morning.
Perhaps if you can tell our audience a little bit about what our subject's going to be today.
My favorite subject, hopefully, which are the honeybees, if you want, also more broadly, pollinators. And the perspective that we could take is a quite political one to talk about their social behavior.
Mm-hmm. Of course, when we met and we discussed this possibility of having the show, you came up with a term that I thought was extremely fascinating. And the term that you used was social mimicry. So perhaps maybe if you can explain to the audience a little bit what the subject's all about.
Yes, I believe it was social biomimicry.
Oh, sorry, social biomimicry.
Right,
My apologies,
right.
yes.
Mimicry is a term.
No,
as
that
well.
means something quite different, yes.
So yeah, just think about biomimicry first to split it up. Let's think about Da Vinci and how he developed certain devices or wanted to develop certain kinds of first airplanes, and he looked at birds. Or how we look at plants to develop what's that called, nanotechnology, or how dolphins communicate, and new communication technology that evolved out of that. So that would be biomimicry, which is learning from nature for basically the benefit of humans, for developing technology. But then there's also social biomimicry, which I would say asks the questions of what can we learn from the honeybees, for example, to improve how we interact with each other as a species, and hopefully also between species. So how can we also improve our approach towards nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was extremely fascinating when you raised the subject, because of course the idea of biomimicry was something that I was familiar with, but I had never really thought of it from a social aspect. But once you mentioned this, once you mentioned it, then I started thinking, of course, this is not really something new. That, well, of course, nature is not new, so it's just a question of to what degree we are capable of actually opening our eyes and observing what's going on around us, which for the audience, as a general rule of thumb, is probably not a bad idea to open the eyes and actually observe what's going on. But then, of course, it's one of those things, once you've been exposed to a concept, then you see it everywhere. In other words, every time I did open my eyes, I was looking for it. And there were a couple of articles that I found, and I was thinking primarily from an organizational perspective. One of the problems that we have within corporations is that we have different silos where people work, and they're doing whatever they're doing, and they feel that the only way that they can make progress is if they can concentrate as an independent group. But the problem is that they're trying to solve problems. They're trying to achieve goals that are much bigger than what's taking place in their department. So it's quite clear if we look at, say, you give the example of the bees, or perhaps if we were to look at ants, would be another example of where they are trying to accomplish something in a relatively quick pace, I would say, and they have to have some way of actually going ahead and communicating with each other. So perhaps going back to the idea of the bees, so how do the bees do it?
The bees communicate through multiple ways, and one of them is vibration. So vibrating their wings on the comb, on the wax, which transmits these vibrations among the hive. Another one is through dancing. Bees also communicate through dancing,
Okay.
which is very beautiful to watch. For the untrained eye, it might just look like she's confused, or why is she going in circles, But actually, there is a system behind that, and every step, the length of the dance, the strength that she vibrates her body while she's doing that, everything indicates something. So it's so interesting to start reading that, and that's exactly as you said. Once you have had access to a new concept, you just see it everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And so how did you actually get started with this subject, if I may ask?
The very start was through my grandparents, who are still beekeepers. My grandfather is now 83 years old. He's still keeping bees, and
Cool.
we work together. So I've had the chance to learn quite a lot from him, and I believe that's also the most beautiful outcome of keeping bees, or everything I do now with the bees, is this new relationship I found to his generation, and a way to communicate with him as well, and have a topic that we always come together to just explore. So that's how it started. And then I studied political science, and then there was a course about political theories, and I was not so satisfied with that course, because I thought, well, every theory that we can think about is a lens. It's like some piece of a pair of glasses that you look through and have a certain vision at the world. And you can use that to benefit, but often it also results in a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I was very cautious of how to use different theories, which then led also to a course about comparing how governments work, some analysis. And at the same time, I was working with bees. So it just naturally came together. And then I thought, well, I don't know. There is democracy, there is communism, there's socialism, there's all of these concepts. And all the tools that we use in political science to look at how a government works, or why we would call it a democracy or a socialist country, can be found in the beehive as well. So you can look at import, like water. You can look at export, the honey, the propolis, the wax. Mm-hmm. You can look at migration between hives, at the hierarchical structure, at how they make decisions, distribution of labor, mm-hmm. certain role of genders, and then of course the queen bee. Everybody's talking about the queen bee, and so that was so fascinating. Which led then to a number of books, and I'm sure some people have heard about the Honeybee Democracy by Thomas D. Seeley, which was the book that laid the foundation for this research on the social behavior of honeybees.
Okay, I haven't heard of the book, so perhaps if you could tell me a little bit about it.
So Tom D. Seeley did experiment for a couple of years off a small island off the mainland of Maine, and he explored, try to put it short, how bees make the decision to find a new home after they have swarmed. So bees have a certain manner to multiply, to reproduce, and that's usually the swarming. So that means that the old queen will leave the hive with about a fourth of the population, usually the older bees. And the first thing they do is they go to a nearby branch. So maybe in social media or in other media, you might sometimes see photos of a bunch of bees just at a very random place. Sometimes they choose really funny places like cars or and then they don't stay there because it does not suit their requirements for a good life. And then this highly interesting process starts where they go out and they define what they need and what this new place could be that they move to as a collective. And this is what Tom D. Seeley explored. And that he's still exploring. He's now 30 to 40 years into researching that. So quite fascinating.
And would that mean that, if I understood you correctly, some stay and some go? What happens to the ones that stay?
So the ones that stay are usually the younger bees. Also, of course, all of the brood, so the bees that have not hatched yet, is there as well. And there is a new queen. So the bees raise a new queen while the old queen is still there. But as soon as this little cell that they built for her, where she's growing, where she's developing, closes, which would be a couple days before she hatches, the old queen knows, okay, it's time for me to go. Or sometimes there is also a fight between the queens.
You stole my next question. So there can be conflict.
There can be conflict. So what the queen, if she wants to stay in power, can do is try to find these cells, which are usually at the very edges of the comb, and bite through it, so that she would kill that unhatched queen. That can happen as well. In some cases, it can also happen that the new queen hatches and the old queen is still there, and then there would be a fight. But the most common reaction is for the old queen to go.
Okay, would that reaction be predetermined? It's kind of the way it sounds. In other words, if this condition is to be found, then these are the actions that we can expect. Does that sound right?
So in general, you can expect the swarming as a beekeeper every year. So the main swarming season is in May. That's when you, if you don't want to lose many swarms, so a big part of your colony and the strength, to some hopefully empty tree trunk where they can find new home, you wanna, as a beekeeper, try to control the process a little bit, introduce artificial swarming. So that means splitting the hive before the bees do it naturally. That is one technique, for example. And there are different approaches to that. So some are very natural. Some beekeepers want to intrude as little as possible and also just let the hives swarm, whereas others are more intrusive, I would say, and also control which queen would hatch which time, basically.
Wow. And that is, it's also to be assumed that it's only the queen bee who would have anything to say?
That's what the name would imply, right? It's quite misleading, though.
Okay.
Well, the title of Tom Seeley's book, Honeybee Democracy, already tells us that it's more of a democratic structure than an authoritarian one, where one person or one bee would make all the decisions. In reality, the queen bee is very important, and she can, in some ways, manipulate the behavior of the colony, mainly through communicating through pheromones. So she has very strong pheromones through which she can tell all the bees in the hive, I'm there, I'm healthy, everything's fine. But her main task, and this is something that should not be forgotten, is to lay the eggs. So the queen bee is the mother of all the bees in the hive. She can lay up to 2,000 eggs a day, which is multiple times her own body weight. And that's her job. That's her main job. So the long-term survival of the hive is very much defined by the performance of the queen bee.
Wow. And that would mean, and please, if I got anything wrong, I know you'll come in and correct me, but it would be all of the other bees that kind of do the heavy lifting otherwise, correct?
I would say laying 2,000 eggs a day is also quite heavy lifting. I wouldn't want to do that.
No, that's true. But as far as creating the beehive, wouldn't that be from the other bees?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, of course they're super important as well. So it's a super organism. No single bee, if it's the queen bee or one female bee or a drone, the male bee, can survive on its own. That's what it means to be a superorganism.
Yeah, please don't get me wrong. I wasn't inferring that the queen bee kind of kicked back and was kind of slouching. That wasn't my intention. But I'm always trying to think, how does this relate to us? And as far as structures that we have, and there's a concept that we call as servant leadership, where the idea is that we as a leader, who could be ordained as a leader or just kind of fall into the role, the most important thing is that the others can actually go ahead and get things done. And so your job is to get rid of all the impediments so that the others can do the work. And I'm wondering if maybe, because there are always threats that are coming to the beehive, what role the queen bee would play then?
She can, as far as my understanding goes, urge the bees to tell more or less what the goal is, but the bees define how.
Ooh, that really does sound like agile. Yes, okay.
So the goal is, it's becoming, which time of the season should we take as an example? Let's talk about April. In Austrian climate, European climate, slowly getting warmer. The bees have hopefully survived the winter. They're still drawing from the last resources, the honey or the sugar fed by the beekeeper. They're eating that. And then they know that the hotter season is going to come up, and especially in May there's going to be a lot of flowers bearing nectar, which they want to then collect. This is also the time where the queen wants to start laying more and more eggs to build the hive, which would also then prepare for the swarm later on, which is also when there's basically almost too many bees in one hive. And so the what would be, we need to have enough food and we need to have enough space for me, the queen, to lay eggs. I need a lot of little cells where I can lay my eggs, in each cell one egg. And what do what does the brood need? They need pollen. They need that bee bread. So the bees go out and collect that as well. So that's I would say as much as a queen goes for deciding what's going on.
Mm-hmm. No, but I really love that description. She decides the what and they decide the how.
So the bees are the female bees, which is the vast majority of the population, is very efficient and very good at defining which tasks need to be done, and they're highly flexible in switching from one field of expertise to the next.
Okay. How do you think we can actually go ahead and learn from these processes that are being followed in perhaps running things a little bit more humane, perhaps a little bit more egalitarian? These would be the goals I would hope that we'd be striving for. What do you think we can learn from bees or any other entities that would be tied to this concept of social biomimicry? What do you think that we can actually learn from a societal perspective?
This might sound almost too simple, but still I believe it's very important to point it out repetitively. Or repeatedly, which is we're not alone on this planet. We're not the only ones, and we are so interdependent, not only with other humans, but with everything. And that's what the bees show us. So if one single bee decides in that swarming process, you know what, this new place that you decided to move to, I don't like it. I'm not going to go with you. That bee is going to die sooner or later. At the latest a couple days later, except if she finds another hive, another colony to join, which then again would mean community. So it's community. It's also respecting the collective decision, which is, I believe that's really important. And then the bees also teach us focusing on the most important factors. So that's what I learned from that swarming process and how they make that decision is always know your baseline. always know the most fundamental needs and how to fulfill them for the group, for the collective. And then there's a lot of things that you can still improve around these, right? We can always strive for perfection, but don't miss that primary goal to first meet your ultimate needs, because we're in such a luxurious society.
Some of us are.
Some of us, absolutely.
Which is really the problem.
Yeah,
and in
exactly.
fact, if just looking from my perspective,
Yeah.
one of the big takeaways that I have from that of what you've been talking about, Nadine, is that we have systems. We have systems as human beings. But unfortunately, within these systems, we do not look at the collective. In other words, we do not value those structures that ensure that everyone within the society is able to survive. And then there is a responsibility that we have within our society that this is indeed taken care of. And if I was to do the comparison with the swarming, with the hive, with the migration and the like, these points are never put into the question with the bees. They never think, oh, do we have to make sure that everybody's okay? That is considered to be self-explanatory.
They also all agree on what the most important factors are. So we can think of that new home, which properties, which characteristics should it have? It should protect from the rain, for example. The volume is really important so that there is at the same time enough space for all the bees throughout the whole season, but it shouldn't be too big, because then it's also very difficult to manage the climate inside, to heat it up to the right temperature, for example. So 40 liters of volume is the optimum, is what Tom Seeley found out. Then we can talk about humidity, access to a water source, access to a food source. So there's a lot of factors, and they're just known by the bees naturally and through, I would say, intuitively. But as a human society, it's important to also come together and find an agreement of what is our baseline as a collective. What do we need?
How do you think they go ahead and transmit that knowledge so that it stays intuitive? Any ideas? Because that's a clear differentiation. Or we could also go ahead and argue that if we were to trust our intuition a little bit more, that perhaps we have a lot of the answers that we're striving for, but we've made the situation so convoluted that we cannot see it. Your thoughts?
I'm totally with you regarding the human intuition as well. There should be more presence for that, more attention to it. But your other question of how can you transmit the?
Well, I'm wondering how they do it, because obviously it couldn't be one-to-one, because there are certain things that as an infant you cannot know. So I wonder if there is some sort of learning that's taking place where they observe the queen bee and they learn from her.
I wouldn't have read anything about that so far, that they would learn from her behavior.
And I don't know.
Of course, it's okay. Because her tasks are just very different. So a female honeybee, which is the one that you will see outside foraging, does not see her mother, the queen, show her how to construct the comb, the wax structure, for example. I personally believe, but that's more of a philosophical approach, that intuition is something so old. It's like a wisdom that is just in us. It cannot be taught. Intuition cannot be, it's not like a book that you can pass on. So I don't know how the bees developed then. It's probably evolutionary. But but they do have a learning process. They do undergo a lot of different stages throughout their lives, in which they just progress and learn new things and switch from one task to the next that fits their capacities. So a bee that has just hatched will not go out and forage because she doesn't know how to navigate and she doesn't know how to fly even. So that will be at the last stage of her life.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we're just talking about phases. I'm going to bring in something completely different into this conversation, just because you've kind of triggered some thoughts in my head. I'm going to make an assumption that you've heard of the book from Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Oh, maybe not. Let me go ahead and explain it to you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, it was a very popular book, or it still is a popular book. Came out, when did I read it? At least 7 years ago. And the idea is that it's specifically tied to this concept of being instinctive, that we feel that we have this gut feeling is usually the phrase that we use. Mm-hmm. And we have a gut feeling. And Kahneman raises the point that what we consider to be instinctive is not instinctive at all. It's based upon some sort of, maybe let's call them tapes that you play, that have absolutely nothing to do with the here and now. In other words, an example that he gave was that you never want to stand in front of a judge right before lunch, because the chances of you getting a severe punishment are very high. Mm-hmm. And so his point is it has nothing to do with the individual. It has nothing to do with the crime per se. It has everything to do with the judge being hungry, and the judge will not come to the conclusion that I'm hungry, so maybe I should take that into consideration when I go ahead and define what the penalties or the punishment is going to be for this person. Even getting to the point of guilty or non-guilty could come to that. So we're talking about something that's actually very, very serious, that's being influenced by something that is so minute, the idea of being hungry, although obviously if you're hungry, you're hungry. But we as human beings are not capable of actually drawing the linkage between these different elements. And so what he goes ahead and says is that we should be able to, I'm going to say count to 10. He didn't refer to it that way, but this is an easier way to understand it. But take a step back, and can you go ahead and look at the situation from a different perspective? And in what you call instinctive is not necessarily always instinctive. I see there's a connection between these subjects, a very strong connection. Mm-hmm. Now, and I think part of it is tied to those things that are truly natural, that we have a lot of baggage as human beings that we take with us. And the baggage doesn't always have to be negative. I'd like to think there's some positive baggage out there as well. But I think this is the big takeaway for me, what Kahneman was talking about, is that we shouldn't confuse the baggage for true instincts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I've heard the title before, but the one book that reminds me very much of this example is, I think it was called The Secret Life of the Mind.
Okay.
I loved it. It gave a lot of examples, such as experiments with people around that subject of decision making, and if it's led by intuition or if it's led through rational thinking. And he gave that simple example of buying a car. So again, referring to the bees, what's your baseline? What do you need? Okay, how many kids do you have? If you have any, is it important that they fit all in the car? Do you have a dog? Do you live in the city on the countryside? All of these factors, should it be below a certain price? So what's your price range? Just know your basics. And it's possible, and it's even recommendable, according to this book, to use the rational mind to figure out a simple question like that and make a pro and con list, write down all the options and then choose. However, if you have a more complex problem that involves many more factors, intuition takes over. So I'm thinking about my own example of finding master's degree. I would just love to study, especially this topic about the social biomimicry. And there are thousands of programs out there because you can see it from the perspective of biology, political science, psychology, management, innovation, so many. So I'm just looking at hundreds of programs. How do I make a decision for that? And this is where intuition is key, really key.
Well, I think I'm going to, you gave me no choice. I'm going to have to go back to some of the rationale that you were referring to. So what's your baseline?
My baseline for the masters?
Yes. You are not spared, Nadine. Sorry.
My baseline for the masters is the price or the option to get a scholarship. So I was accepted for master programs in the past, which I had to decline because of the price. So this is, of course, also a very ethical question about the accessibility of education, which I think we could talk a whole hour about, at least.
Well, I think we could do a whole series on that.
Yes. I'm up for that one. So that is crucial because I wouldn't enjoy studying and at the same time being so anxious about how many years it's going to take to pay it back. It wouldn't be enjoyable. The location does play a role, but the most important thing for me is the quality, which means the people that you're really going to directly work with. But it is, apart from that baseline, very much a feeling because there's so many factors. Which subjects are there? Like which subjects can I engage with, etc., etc. What are the people? What's the duration? Is there an online option? It's so many factors. So when I make my choice, I also have some kind of intuition scale, and it goes from 0 to 10, and 10 is the best. And I just give it a number of how good does it feel. If I imagine myself, if I envision myself studying that program, how well, how good does it feel, to put it short.
Would there be an option to maybe cover the learning in a different way apart from the university?
That's what I've been trying to do in the last couple of years because I've been out of university for 4 years. So all of that, everything I know about the bees basically is informal learning, everything. I wanted to write my bachelor thesis about it, but my professor said it's too specialized and I should keep it for a master's. So I just went to many different places to learn. So I went even to the Middle East to go work as a volunteer with topic of keeping honeybees, and conflict was a little bit of a topic there. Then I wrote my bachelor thesis in the end about an indigenous community in Argentina, and I hope to see a beekeeping project there. And then I was a volunteer for 10 months in Denmark for the European Solidarity Corps, and I put up I would say, sustainable beekeeping project for this eco-village. Learned a lot about, small-scale entrepreneurship and project management. And then I helped people in Spain also to create their own beekeeping project and get EU funding for it. And then, so it just led from one project to the next, basically. And that's how I learn all the time.
It's the way it works in life, yeah.
Yeah. But still, I'm very much looking forward to get some more scientific foundation, simply because I like engaging my brain that way as well.
Well, I can definitely relate to that one. One of the big takeaways for me on this subject is the ability for us to learn how we create structures. So societal structures, could be organizational structures, that emphasize probably in a very blatant way, because unfortunately we as human beings are only capable, unless it's totally thrown in our face, to truly understand the message. So how do we go ahead and create structures that make it very blatant that the only way for us to survive is based on interdependency? In other words, we create new societal structures. Could be in business organizational structures. I think it would work the same way. Mm-hmm. So that it's quite apparent that the only way that we can progress as a society is to base things on the structure. And one of the key components of the structure would be making sure that nobody's left behind. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course, when we talk about nobody being left behind, I'm referring to not just the human beings, but everything tied to it, because we have this cockamamie idea that nature is something separate, and we don't quite understand that we are part of nature. Mm-hmm. So within that model, and I look at this as an opportunity, I hope you're okay with that, to kind of hypothesize as to, so what would that be? What can we learn from bees? Or I'm not very well versed in the subject, but I've read a little bit about ants and the way that they do things as well. And there are obviously, we have plenty of examples throughout nature. And so I'm not going to embarrass myself in talking about things that I'm not well versed in. But one thing I do understand is the idea of coming up with structures that emphasize this interdependency.
Well, the structures that create interdependency are there. They're everywhere. We are interdependent.
Of course we are, but it's not blatant.
That awareness. It's that awareness. Talk about the virus, COVID. So if you listen to experts in the field of biodiversity or virology as well, they say it's not surprising. It's not surprising at all that this happened, because if you keep cracking open habitats, some things are going to escape. Some things are going to come out of that, which can be viruses, which can be bacteria, which can be a certain species that doesn't belong in that new habitat. And we've had that in the past, that we are exploring, some jungles or some exotic places, and then we are confronted with a virus that we cannot deal with because our body is not ready for that, has never had any connection to it. And so the more we go into destroying, cracking open habitats, the more likely it is that certain viruses will interfere with our lives. So we cannot be independent of biodiversity. Biodiversity is the diversity of species, the genetic diversity, and also the diversity of habitats where these species can thrive. It's basically, how would I say that? It's the balance. It's a balance of everything. It's defined by the diversity. So if one factor fails, there's still a lot of other factors that can fix it. And if we reduce these factors by the sixth mass extinction that we are in, we're putting ourselves at a very severe risk. Mm-hmm.
So we can go back to the bees maybe, and look in how do they keep, assuming that we do not have the impediments that are caused by human beings. Let's remove that to the side in a pure state, as far as we can define a pure state. And I think we have to base it on something. So how would the bees go ahead and come up with that balance to make sure that they are not encroaching on areas where they could have an undue effect, which is one of the takeaways, that they come up with an environment so they can best thrive. That would be another one, right? That they would understand I'm just blue skying this here, that they would, if they would understand the repercussions of certain actions, and of course I'm trying to build a bridge between the two. How do you think they do it?
Well, if you have a look at how bees evolved, they evolved from wasps in the first place, and then just at some point decided to go vegan and formed this connection with the plants. So what is very important is pollination, right? So there is this this collaboration that mutually benefits the plant and the bee, because the bee gets the nectar, gets the pollen. So the nectar is the carbs source, and the pollen is a protein source, to put it simply. And the bee also wants to forage on this flower or on this kind of plant the next season. I mean, not the same bee, but another bee from the same hive. So it needs to make sure at the same time that this plant is going to survive. And this is how pollination came up, because plants are not only reproducing through the wind or asexually, so that means through the roots, for example, but also sexual reproduction of plants is through pollination. So carrying the pollen from the stamen to the pistil. Sort of from the male to the female part of the plant. And this is what the honeybee guarantees, or not only the honeybee, but every pollinator, which is moths, flies, wild bees, etc., birds. So the bee has very much sparked this interdependence with other species and understands it quite well. And so then the honeybee evolved as a eusocial, as a very social organism, as a superorganism, which would probably live slightly different if they were still out in nature, not managed by humans. But the basics would be the same. So they would still look for the kind of cavity where they can what they can call their home. But by now they have an interdependence with humans as well, because we've been taking care of them for so long. They got used to certain chemicals that were treating them to fight off their one of their biggest threats, which is the varroa mite. Of course, there's other threats that we need to talk about, like climate change, etc. Pesticides.
I was thinking pesticides, right?
quite an important one. But it would not be possible to say right now, let's bring this hive back into the forest and let's just see how it does on its own. I mean, there are a lot of experiments like that, but they're monitored, right? So sometimes there are places, there are habitats that are so intact that honeybees can thrive there as a savage colony. But where do you find that around here, for example? We're in Vienna. Not possible. Most of the forests around us are also too clean. So no rotting tree trunks, mycelium everywhere, mushrooms growing on these broken tree trunks. We don't have that. The forests are too clean. So it would be quite difficult for the honeybee right now to find a habitat that is suitable for her to survive on her own, unfortunately.
Wow. Thanks for that. That was very, very interesting. One of the takeaways from that, or what you were discussing, was the idea of not necessarily for you as a single bee or for your clan or your tribe, but rather the idea of keeping things in a manner so that the next generation can actually go ahead and profit from it. That was my take from what you were talking about, which I thought was very, very interesting, which has to be, again, something that is innate. And And you would think as human beings, isn't that part of the discussion that we're having with climate change?
Yes, it's sustainability. It's exactly that, which is a term that comes from foresters who just thought about how many trees can I cut down so that the forest can still remain healthy and a future generation can also cut down some trees for their benefit. And that's just sustaining. That's keeping the baseline, right? That's keeping the most important factors that keep us happy and alive, and every other species as well. However, I noticed the discussion moving from sustainability to regeneration, because we're at that point already where we need to talk regeneration, rebuilding, repairing, and improving the habitats, and also not only the habitats but also the way we interact with each other.
You stole the words right out of my mouth, because I was going to say that this current system is not worth sustaining. No. And so therefore we need to actually go ahead and do a complete reset. But of course, in an ideal world you can, but we do not have that possibility simply because there are so many dependencies, unhealthy dependencies that we've established that make that type of exercise extremely difficult. And so you can only approach it with the intention of measuring to what degree do I truly understand it, because there could be some things that we don't understand along the way. So we're very good as human beings, especially when I think about the concept of a progress. And that progress is the driver for us to move forward, whereas we know for a fact that there's such a thing as what we call a progress trap that we keep falling into, because the more we produce, the more we need, which is clearly not part of this model that you've been discussing for the last 45 minutes. And so the real question is, so how do we go ahead and move forward? Let me give you an example and see if maybe we can try to loop this into the subject. One of the biggest problems that I run across quite often, especially when we're looking at global supply chains, we come up with these models that are based on equity, they're based on ecology and the like, but what we don't raise is the question that the model per se is the source of the problem. In other words, if we're looking at a global supply chain where we expect individuals from the global south to produce things that are actually solely being used by us, meaning, and we saw this quite clearly in the beginning of the pandemic, where the supply chains completely fell apart, that we ruined the livelihood for so many people in the global south simply because those things that they were producing, they weren't using themselves. They were purely for our enjoyment, quote unquote. And that is obviously a structure that's not tenable. And within this model that you've been describing, that would never be under discussions, if the bees go out for a beer or whatever they do, that they would never go ahead and say, well, would we go ahead and follow that path? That would clearly not be part of it. So before we actually go ahead and start disassembling global supply chains, we need to come up with an opportunity for individuals within the global south to have those regenerative structures, because otherwise we're going to recreate the problem that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic, that all of a sudden, because of this dependency that we had built into this model, they were left high and dry. So this is really interesting, because I was thinking about what you were describing about the dependency that we've created with the bees, because we've been caring for them, and we've created an environment that that if we were not able to take care of them in some fashion, then we don't know exactly what their fate would be. If I was to take it to the extreme, I think this would probably be a period of time where they would be able to recuperate, but
something I would like to point out there, I'm not sure if I'm answering this question, but it's just so
I think
important.
It was more of a rant than anything else. Yeah.
So important to point this out. The number of honeybees in Europe is increasing and has been for the last couple of years. Yes, there was a time, I think 2016, 17, where there was a big upheaval about that topic. Oh my God, the bees are dying. And yes, for example, in the United States, where everything is much more industrialized around the honeybee, they do have a problem. But currently, the honeybee is not at the risk of extinction. This is really important to point out, because everybody who sees Save the Bees ads around them might think immediately about the honeybee, because very often these ads are accompanied with pictures of the honeybee, and then there are companies that say, we save the bees, we care about the environment because we have beehives on our rooftops. This is a very typical example of the past couple of years, become very popular. And I believe that these companies do have good intentions, because if they think about the bees, they just love the bee and they really want to take care about the bee. Many times I've seen that. So I don't want to assume a priori that they just do it for PR, because people really love the honeybee. But what we really need to talk about are wild pollinators, are all the other pollinators, because they don't have the support of the beekeeper. The honeybee is okay because she will be shielded off many potential diseases, many risks, the cold winter, or possible destruction of their hives from by the beekeeper. But the wild pollinators are way more sensitive, and these are the ones that are really, really, really at extinction. So just to give one number of what's going on, there has been the Krefelder Studie, a study that was carried out in Germany over the course of 25 years, and what they found out was that, and it was in a global, in a Natura 2000 area, so a nature protected area, which means that the conditions should be better than somewhere else. The biomass, the insect biomass, has decreased by 75%. 3/4 of all the insects that lived there were gone after 25 years in a protected area. So we can only imagine how bad it is in other places. And these are not honeybees. So, I mean, I see it as my mission with Pollinator Ambassadors to use that image of the honeybee to help all the other pollinators as well. And I want to point out, that does not mean that we shouldn't aim to improve the life of the honeybee, because it's a evolutionary success, because there's so many of them, it does not mean that they have a good quality of life. It's the same for humans. It's also something that we can learn from the bees. Simply because we're increasing in numbers, it does not mean that we're enjoying ourselves more. And so, yes, the bees do have a hard time. They're suffering a lot of diseases. They're dying early, So we should definitely have the responsibility to learn more about them in order to treat them better. Same about every other species.
Wow.
Yeah.
As is always the case, it takes us a while, and then we really get into the flow. And I noticed that in the passion of you going ahead and describing these things. And I think within that question of the baseline that you were asking yourself, I think you just answered that question right now. It doesn't even matter what it is and how you go ahead and continue. You just described your baseline. The rest doesn't even matter. That's my personal take. We have a few more minutes. We end at 57. You have a better view of the clock. So perhaps maybe if there's any other parting words that you'd like to go ahead and share with us before we end this session today.
Well, yeah, thanks. How do you say, cycle back?
or circle back.
Circle back. I'm into biking. Yeah. It's cycling. To circle back to what you mentioned about how can we make these structures. You mentioned the global supply chain. There's endless ways to go about it. That's a beauty of of the interconnectedness. You can start anywhere. Everybody can start anywhere. And that means you can be really, really creative of going about systems change, thinking about systems change. And my personal approach is through social biomimicry, which I believe carries potential because it is a method to create more appreciation for nature and to really foster some fascination for, wow, that's going on in the hive. I've not met one single person that I talked about this with that was not in some way interested, because it is really, really fascinating. And that way we can just spark more of that interest for what's actually going on around me. And appreciation and respect, not freaking out when there's a honeybee around me or some other insect, reducing that disgust that we have for certain creatures, for certain bugs, and know that it's there also for your own benefit. So that's my approach about it. It's more rather cultural, I would say, and it can also be explored through the arts. Exploring nature through the arts. There's not one single museum that you would enter that does not engage with nature or portray nature in some way or the other.
I don't know if I mentioned this prior, but this show is based upon three principles: empowerment, inclusiveness, being the prerequisites for social transformation. So without even knowing it, you put together a great business case for that of what I've been trying to preach the entire time. Nadine, thank you very much.